Karibuni.
Sansana.
Molweni. Molweni is hello in South African, and Karibuni.
Karibuni is you're welcome.
So we welcome you to this chat between myself and Sanaa Gateja. I wanted to first kind of give you an insight into when I first encountered Sanaa's work. I'm a South African, so the Cape Town Art Fair is a regular engagement with the old and the young, those who are interested in art or maybe just curious or passionate in art. And so maybe I'd say about 10 years ago, I started to see Sanaa's work in books and hearing other curators talk about your work. And I think in the most recent maybe 5 years, 6 to 5 years, I had the option of taking part in some of the Cape Town Art Fair events. And really, it's the most art fairs, you have a sea of artworks by hundreds of artists. And each and every one is fighting for your attention. And then you encounter a Sanaa, and you stop, because at first it's like, okay, what kind of paint is that? Because you, from afar, you are assuming firstly it's paint. So if it's paint, it's really thick impasto, like what's happening, And so for me, it was really about first being curious. What is the work? Who is the artist? How did he make this work? And the closer you get, you see that it's thousands of small rolled beads. And then you're like, okay, how did you do this? And so it became for me an opportunity to be curious about Sanaa, to learn more from others who knew more about his work. And over time, it really was a search actually to acquire some works for some of the institutions I was responsible for in South Africa. Unfortunately, we were not able to, but maybe now that I'm on this side of the world, something can happen. But it was really an amazing journey of really getting to visually experience Sanaa's work, and then now finally being able to engage with you in the flesh. And as was indicated, Sanaa has been referred to as the bead king. And I, as a South African, have a passion for beads. And beads, within many African cultures, has so many different meanings and ways of experiencing what they mean, whether it's through a spiritual process, engaging with one's ancestors, whether it's through a process of birth, where a young child is given a special beaded bracelet over their wrists and their feet, whether it's a process of adornment to beautify oneself, whether it's a visual language, for example, in a Zulu love letter, that's a secret message to lovers, and not necessarily a endearing message, but it's a hidden visual language that only the wearer and the creator would know. And so beads, for me, my connection with it is not just as an object that is used to create artworks, but it is kind of intrinsically embedded in the social fabric of many African societies. So this is a really great opportunity for me to get a chance to get to know Sanaa better. But before that, I just wanted to give a quick bio or a summary of Sanaa and his visual language, if you'll allow me. So Sanaa Gateja is a multidisciplinary artist who is widely known for his signature incorporation of recycled man-made materials in his practice, particularly his pioneering fashioning of beads from discarded paper, which earned him, as we now know, the name the Bead King of Uganda. Heavily influenced by the potters, blacksmiths, and basket weavers in his home village of Kisoro, correct? In Uganda, Sanaa is a visual artist who creates intricate works which reference indigenous art practices like weaving and stitching. He works with bark cloth, paper, raffia, beads, wood, and banana fiber to construct large textured artworks that respond to the subject of nature and materiality. These works straddle installation, tapestry, sculpture, and Sanaa allows the materials to speak in its own microcosmic ways. These abstract, at times, narratives commenting on social and political realities in his home country, Uganda. Sanaa has studied interior design in Italy, jewelry design at Goldsmith in London, and has exhibited extensively across the African continent as well as internationally. So with that said, I will start the questions, if you don't mind. So my first question, and I think this gives a good groundwork to understanding your journey as an artist, because at the age of 18, you were employed as an assistant crafts officer for the Ugandan Ministry of Culture and Community Involvement, and where you had the responsibility of traveling across the country to collect arts and crafts. And then in 1971, you resigned from that position to then follow your path as an artist. So can you talk to us about those moments post-independence and your eventual journey to encounter art as a creative?
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate your introduction. You can realize that 1960s in Africa is when many countries got their independence. Uganda got its independence from the British in 62. I was in secondary school, or primary school, sort of going to secondary school, studying art in a school in a city that was dominated by Indian. It was called the Government Indian Secondary School, and we were 2 Africans there. Most of our other schools were Christian schools in the villages, but this one was a government school, and I appreciated the that they are teaching good lessons like art and music. And so my background, living in a village, had introduced me to a lot of art forms that are traditional and functional. And here I was meeting artworks that were art ways of working or creating art that were foreign, but fascinating, because it was sort of like taking a brush and a canvas and creating something. And I didn't enjoy it because I didn't have the full command of English, nor did I have teachers that were sort of pushing me, and also I was a bit rebellious because there was a feeling of identity crisis, that the Africans were trying to identify themselves as in control of their lives and of their politics. So this feeling of freedom brought about individual discovery. If you are not in politics, if you're not in churches, if you're not in, you yourself as a child wanted to express and be seen as genuine, to be, it was fun. So I think my seeds of being an artist were planted at that time. and my leaving school, secondary school, to go to work for the government was in a way a pursuit of my own childhood visual training, because the country was creating shops that wanted an identity again, and were creating these shops that sold traditional crafts and art, but also to stimulate the making in the villages of these things, creating incomes in the villages by people who were not in the streamline employable. These people were living self-sufficiently and living their own lives, but making their own art. And it was time for them to make money from their own art. So I realized that I was involved in this wonderful development. Yeah.
And it's interesting, 1957, March of 1950, I think it was March, Ghana obtained independence. And from Ghana's independence, it really reawoken the African continent to the possibility of emancipation from colonial powers. And so you had this decade of the 60s being the decade of Africa. Well, 1960 was the year of Africa. And that phrase is just referring to the number of countries that obtained independence in one year. But within that decade, over 17 countries African countries obtained independence. And as Sanaa rightfully said, those moments was really about this reawakening of understanding or interpreting what does it mean to be an African post-independence, post-colonial, within a colonial space that no longer existed. And so artists, musicians, writers were all engaging with this notion of reimagining one's sense of self. And creativity was that first way of engaging with this new sense of reimagining the African body. And so, within your experience of, as you're indicating, figuring out how do I exist as this individual who is from an African country without the shackles of a colonial regime. And so that decade, the 60s and 70s in particular, were quite vibrant, quite tumultuous, in that creators were really critically looking at this idea of reawakening. Fela Kuti being one of those musicians, one of those artists who was unashamed of being African and very critical of the state of Africa. And so you then moved to London. After Kenya, when did you move across the seas?
I think I was a very good worker in this Ministry of Culture and Community Development, because I was then promoted and I went to Japan, to work in the shop selling crafts for the ministry. And there, as a young person, probably 19, 20, I was exposed to the whole international activity of art and design. I remember I participated in all sorts of things, including fashion shows, because I was quite...
As the model or the designer?
As a model, yeah.
Okay.
No, I was hired as a model, and I think I could see possibilities of selecting areas that I could be strong in. And the way that I was employed was restrictive. So, and because we were earning a bit of money in this foreign land, that I really enjoyed being in for 8 months, I resigned and went to Kenya with the family. And we lived in Kenya, and so I had to find something to do. And with the money I saved, I started a studio where I would sell the Ugandan familiar crafts and things that I saw. And then in Mombasa, some of you in Kenya, you know, it is an old city, town, that the Eastern, the Arab, the Indian, and then from the interiors you have the Congolese, you have the Mozambican, you have, it was a wonderful place of activity and creativity and importation of traditional, all sorts of things. So my studio evolved into an antique shop or a design shop. And while I was there in 1972, 73, I met a very interesting man who inspired me in the way he was working. And he's right here, Holland Millis, who was a volunteer at the time for the Peace Corps. And so we became friends, and he was running a handicapped workshops, making jewelry out of copper, banana fiber, wood, and, you know, out in the village. So I became the agent for them. So, yeah, eventually I sold my business and I went to Italy because I realized I could either be an interior designer, I could either be something within the arts, but of course I wanted to be an artist. But where do I start from? And by selling the business, I enrolled in a correspondence course to learn interior design. And I met European masters, the Renaissance time. I met the designers in Germany. I met them in the books I read. And so I thought Italy would be a very good landing place. And I went with my family, 2 children and my wife. We landed in Florence. Of course, I thought Florence was perfect for a starting point. Yeah, and that's how I went to Europe.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how did you encounter this process that we see in front of us? When within those time periods were you thinking about, now as an artist, post your studies, what are you going to do? How are you going to create?
All along I had to make an income because I was supportive of myself. Beads came to my mind because I think every artist sometimes has a time when they go back to their childhood and identify themselves with where they came from and identify themselves with what they saw, the stories they heard, their parents. And my journey backwards landed on my auntie's beads on her neck that I used to see when I was 5. These beads were very big and black and white, and they were very appealing and yet frightening for a young person. And they never left my imagination. And so, becoming a jeweler, a goldsmith and a silversmith in Italy, and in London, working for jewelers and introducing myself to casting and all forms of jewelry making, I was attracted to making beads because a bead has magical feelings. A bead has an amazing ability to become very big or very small and yet retain that magic. In Ghana, before you marry, in the olden days, you would take your gold to a goldsmith and they would make the gold necklace or beads, whatever. But you had to come with some words that you would speak when the gold became molten, when it was liquid.
Like an incantation.
Yeah, and
Wow.
and immediately you speak these words of love. Then the flame would be taken off the
Wow.
gold, and immediately gold has a habit of immediately sealing itself into
Wow.
the ball. So
So those words are sealed.
sealed within the
Wow.
jewelry. And these beads to me have that appeal that they are actually sealing and containing secrets or information and so forth.
And so we'll get to that now. This process of, you mentioning, being goldsmith, where there's fire, there's heat, there's, minerals that are engaging with different surfaces. Here we have paper, we have bark, we have, what are you using to actually make what we see? The materiality of the actual object.
The material, the pieces you see here are made up of, first of all, the beads are rolled out of paper, magazines, newspapers, not so much. The newspapers will make the little bowls, the papier-mâché you see, because the newspapers, their sort of character in sort of weight, paper weight, is not so good. You need more hardy paper to make a bead. And also you need paper that has color that you could then use in your painting, in your repertoire. So here we have beads rolled out of magazines, National Geographic, House and Garden, all sorts of magazines, including office paper, that is black and white, which we then dye to create colors. And then they are, after dyeing with the glue and an organic varnish we make in Uganda, the beads are then made into sewn on bark cloth. There's something behind, in all these works, there's bark cloth behind it. Bark cloth is made out of a ficus tree. An old ancient art of making fabric and cloth. We used to wear this bark cloth. And it's warm, and it has, it's mosquito repellent. It still retains this smell in it. And I love it because it is one of the heritages that is used for burial. It embalms the bodies of the dead. It has been used in the Egyptian tombs. It's got a long history. And so I have a fanciful feeling that I'm putting the beads to where they belong. Having come from trees, they go back to the tree.
That's
And
true.
so they're resting on the tree, but luckily they're not dead. They're alive.
They're definitely living.
Yeah.
So this idea of rolled secrets, whether it's National Geographic's newspaper articles, tell us more about these secrets. Are you choosing the particular magazines for subject matter, or are the materials that you choose for, as you mentioned, some are sturdier than others? You did indicate that you do use dyes to change their colors. So what is it about this idea of secrets, of untold or maybe forgotten or hidden words?
Selecting secrets, it's a mixture of beads there. For example, this piece here, it's a school catalog. That was, a calendar, the school calendar, that was going to be sold to the parents when they brought their children to school. You know, you give them or you sell them very cheaply a calendar. But this calendar had amazing colors. You see the oranges and the reds and the sort of brown. That's the calendar. It's full of pictures of children, the school itself, and some of the interesting things about education. So here we have information about Ugandan education hidden in those beads. And then the colored ones are office papers or some other magazines that may not have an appeal like a character that I may have dyed in a different color. But and then, of course, this piece is called Family Meeting, but I named them not because of the secrets, but the secrets are secrets, and they're in there. Yeah.
And then your choice to title works, what process are you following? What is it? Do you have an idea first of what you would like to make, and then that idea unfolds? Or is it a choice of a color that engages you, and then it tells you? As someone who was formerly an artist, so for me, you know, process and engaging with from idea to the actualization of a work is extremely interesting for me. So take us through your process of creating a work.
Okay, I may sketch in a little, I have many little notebooks, sometimes on a piece of paper. And then, but the piece of barcloth behind plays a big part in the creative process. Because I work on the ground, because they're big, that I can't sort of hang them. But I also like to work on the ground because the light is coming from above, from the window, the sun and so on. And I'm looking on this piece of barcloth that I've cut to size. And sometimes I don't like to be mean when I'm using barcloth because it's a good piece of cloth, and I want to give it a good size. So then I get a chalk, and I start to paint, to sketch. But I sometimes have to look closely to the barcloth because the light that comes onto it reflects the maker's mallets and various other marks on this barcloth. And these marks sometimes have these shadows. And as you will see, I love nature and I love the unseen. I love these elements of surprise in our lives. And that's, I think, artists have a way of evoking or being evoked to see things that otherwise
others don't see.
Yeah. So I see this in the barcloth and I will follow it and relate it to the sketch, or sometimes completely give up the sketch and just go with it. And this technique of working, which is a construction of elements, of units that we have made outside, like say leaves, circles. I work with a number of women that will make these units.
These pieces.
So, and then, of course, there's a rhythm in the movement of objects. Like, I love nature nowadays. I use nature a lot because I think in nature there lies nature and human beings are very much together. Intertwined.
Yeah.
And we get our medicines from leaves, we get our movements from the wind and leaves, and so I feel that my influence is coming from nature a lot of times. So that's how I come up with a name after the work is finished. And look closely, because a lot of my titles are to do with community, are to do with spiritual well-being, are to do with friendship, are to do with hope. A lot of hope, because I feel that there's sort of lot of negative things that happen. And instead of dwelling on the negative, I could dwell on hope and activities of pleasure. It's maybe not of pleasure, but happiness. Yeah.
You just mentioned, in your art practice, the kind of the necessity of working as a collective. You have a large group of individuals who create these beads for you, who then also create those units, as you indicated. How important is this idea of working with a collective or as a collective in relation to, would you be able to create this on your own, these hundreds of beads on your own, and then comprise this work? What is the difference and what is the appeal of engaging with a collective?
It's a very interesting question, because I'm from the village. I was born in the village, where people would come and you'd brew beer, you'd cook, you'd hire some musicians, and then the village members would come and dig the entire 4 or 5 acres of land in one day. So you can imagine there are very many. And after that, there is drinking, dancing, eating, and the job is done. So growing up and seeing people harvesting and working together and being able to carry out a job and do it well. As an artist, I can train what I learn as a skill and train many people and then do the same. But since I don't brew beer, I don't cook, I will pay them money to do this job. And I have quite many people that I work with. And in a way, I'm looking at re-establishing the connection between people and their environment, because the way we stitch is not foreign. The way we roll paper with your hands is not so foreign. The subject matter of what I do may be foreign. I mean, my character may be a bit, I'm an artist, so artists are not unknown to them. So it's actually, in a way, bringing back a community to prosperity and development. I think.
And you mentioned earlier on, with your memories of the village and the individuals in the village making art, but functional objects as part and parcel of their daily lived experience. So art is not beyond the kind of everyday engagement, whereas in many other spaces, art is aligned to a specific or special group of people. Whereas in your experience, you are remembering and also kind of bringing back how art has always been part of a collective experience.
Yes, I think art really is collective. When I first started to do art, and I was living in a village, having come from UK, in London I met very many young Africans, Indians, communities in London. The minorities were put together in a way of, we met each other, we had same interests, and we shared a lot of talks, a lot of work, and many would wish to go back and work from their homes. Some couldn't. I was able to, I was one of the ones that went back. And so that feeling of working with the community and creating a new way of form art, of teaching art, of actually relating art to what the people used to look at art as, is interesting. I took a piece of artwork to the village, and immediately one woman just wore it, and I thought, She treated it like a piece of something that she could wear, and she looked amazing. Sat down, and this, you can imagine somebody wearing something like that. So I get ideas from people in that way. It's how we have drawn the line between communities and sort of intellectual lives, you know.
I think the next question is quite in line with that, in that, you know, artists, whether they're from the African continent or not, are more and more involved with, you know, technology, and whether it's in the making or the promoting of their work using a number of platforms. So, you know, beyond the act of the machines that were used to make the magazine prints, were used to print the newspaper, is technology, does it have a place in your practice at all?
Technology to cut the paper in quantities that I need. But otherwise, I do not want to make machines that can roll beads, because I have enough people and distribute my money, and I have enough. No, people have to use their hands. And there's a lot of hands. And when you use your hands, there's a gratification. It's like when you clean your house and you wear something and you're using your hands. I think human beings shouldn't lose the ability to use their hands in many ways. You comb your hair and style yourself, and you don't just go to a hairdresser and just be and come out anew, you know, like, I don't know, but I feel technology is good, but in art there's a need for a human presence. Yeah.
I think also, you know, I wanted to just highlight in many instances in the kind of current atmosphere of contemporary art from the African continent, you know, the visual language of representation. Portraiture is very popular at the moment amongst the young crop of artists. And I was just curious about how your work has been received by your community of artists or outside of the continent, with this trend of representation, with the trend of portraiture being the trend of the moment, and your works being quite the opposite. How has your work been received?
I think my work is being received well because there's a lot of comments that I've had from people that are very, very positive, even among some of us here, because there's a lot of work being put in. There's a lot of feelings being put in. There's it's a different way of working. And there's always this tendency to want to discover. And I think people are discovering me and appreciating that the amount of labor put into something like that is to be made beautiful, is worth what it is. So I'm happy about it, and encourages me and to continue to work in this way.
I was speaking to someone earlier today in my exhibition, where they were complaining about the value of some of the garments in the shop, and I made a similar reference to what Sanaa is indicating. A kente cloth is made by hand by an individual that spends hours crafting a garment, a textile that then becomes a garment. And so that process, that labor that's required, that's invested in making the work, and then another process in actually making the garment is all part and parcel of the final result in the form of value. And also referring to this idea of, I made a reference between targets, something that you would buy in, a space that's really, the quality of the material is not necessarily the highest quality. And referring to a kente cloth. So you buy and you acquire for longevity, because the work because it's an artwork that you acquire will last for generations. And so this process that you invest in the making, from the process of making the beads, where it's thousands of hours of many hands that have really worked as a collective to create these assortment of colors, and even, as you mentioned, these units, and then you as the executor of the final result creates something that we are able to appreciate. So that laborious process is absolutely fascinating. And I think it's important for people to understand that art is work. Art is work. And that process requires an appreciation beyond the visual of how a work is made. And so, I have been thinking about, you are of the generation of the Elena trees. Elle is, I think, 4 years older than you. I checked the dates. A crop of artists of yours and Elena Tree's generation that were using, materials that would be seen as waste, and creating absolute wonders from things that an everyday object like a newspaper or a magazine that's discarded. Similarly, Elle creating, amazing tapestries out of bottle tops. And so now you have a new crop of artists. You have the Wallen Maponderas, you've got the Serge Clotis, you've got so many of the young artists, Maurice Mbikai's, that are actually following in your footsteps, using the discarded materials, using the banal materials. For example, Maurice Mbikai uses discarded computer parts to create some of the most amazing garments and photographic installations. Serge Clotis uses, in Ghana, there are these water carriers. They are yellow and used mainly by women. But he then chose to use these water carriers and cut them out to make these intricate tapestries. Again, something that seems very banal, but absolutely amazing in terms of its final visual execution. So there's a number of artists, younger crop of artists, that are really maybe looking at you and your generation as inspiration, whether you know it or not. And what would you say to those young ones in terms of the process of being a creative, and how, in your experience, your longevity of consistently working as an artist, but also this process of using discarded materials as your main visual language? Is there anything you want to tell them?
I think that when a creative person embarks on making something, however hard it may be, it could be laborious and very hard, but at the end of it, you're very, very happy to have got it right to your satisfaction. And when you do that, whoever acquires it actually joins you in that happiness, and that person will always, forever enjoy that piece. Because it's done with love, it's made with intent to please and to discover and to educate. And in this way, the young generation today, working in the recycling or making of things, I'm glad and I'm happy, because global need to care and concern ourselves with our environment is so important and is so acute that when the young people start to play around with saving the environment from the ugliness of waste and creating beauty out of it, doesn't stop there, but they are going to create spaces for the next generation for a better life in future. So I'm happy that they do that. Art that is representational is very good, and it can talk a lot, because we do know ourselves and we need those feelings and we know who we are and so on. But I'm attracted to something bigger that will go in the abstract, that will go in the video. Everybody loves something as individuals. So you never know. Among us here, everybody has their own love for something to look at. So there is space, this open space for whatever comes.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Sanaa.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.